Welcome back. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico. This Saturday, September 11th, there'll be many commemorations, not only in the United States, but around the world, remembering the terrorist attacks in the United States 20 years ago. Joining us today to talk about how Mexico, at least the Mexican government, lived through this process, made decisions, and how this event, which not only affected the United States, but it did have a major impact around the world, how this event affected the bilateral relationship. Joining me today is Dr. Jorge Castañeda. You know him well. At the time these terrorist attacks took place, he was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for President Vicente Fox. Jorge, welcome to the show. If I recall, when these attacks took place, you weren't in Mexico, but you were probably at the most important strategic place to be, considering what was happening in the United States. Welcome to the show, Jorge.
Yes, Ana Maria, hi, it's nice to speak to you. I was not in Mexico. I was in Lima, Peru, where the foreign ministers of the entire Western Hemisphere met to sign the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which had been drafted over the previous 2 years in the Organization of American States. And so we were all there, and in particular, of course, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell was there, and we all had a chance both to express our solidarity with the government and the people of the United States directly to him, and also to hear his first reaction, literally seconds after the videos came on CNN. We finished our meeting, we signed the charter, everyone shared their grief and solidarity with Powell, and then everybody tried to get home as quickly as possible.
Jorge, once you came home, once you came back to Mexico City, just give us a sense as to how decisions were made, not only to react to this terrorist attack, but in part to deal with a United States government that was very fearful of new terrorist attacks.
Well, we had two issues to deal with, Ana Maria. The first, of course, was to express our solidarity and our grief to the American people and the American government, and that was done largely by President Fox over the following couple of weeks, 3 weeks, and he was able to travel to DC and New York in early October, about 20 days after after 9/11. We had just been in Washington 3 days before, literally, and so we didn't want to sort of go immediately again and make a nuisance of ourselves. That part was done by the president and by Mexican society in general. I think the government was very clear and forthcoming and outspoken on these matters. Mexican society was a bit more ambivalent. But the other issue we had to deal with the Americans right from the beginning, perhaps unlike other countries, except for Canada, is that sharing a border with the United States, we had to immediately see what kind of security arrangements the Americans wanted in order to be as effective as possible in stopping any further attempts. We didn't know, nobody knew at the time, if there were more coming terrorist attacks. And we also had to deal with the fact that the airspace was closed over the US and in flights between Mexico and the United States. And of course, we have more flights from Mexico to the United States than any other country in the world. From 20 or so Mexican cities to 20 or so American cities. So we had to deal with that. We had to deal with stranded American visitors, be they tourists, businessmen, etc., in Mexico who couldn't go home. And so we tried to be, in the first place, on both fronts, to be as close to the Americans as possible, not to bargain or in any way nitpick issues with them, but be as gracious, as generous, and as expressing as much solidarity as possible on the one hand, and on the other hand, to be as accommodating as we could on the security arrangements. And we began negotiations for a thing that was called Esta, which the negotiations lasted until February. And we finally were able to reach a 22-point agreement or something like that, which has worked very effectively, so effectively that at least publicly, there has been no public mention of any infiltration, suspicion, attempt by anyone to enter the United States from Mexico with terrorist designs.
Jorge Castañeda is joining us today, former Secretary of Foreign Relations during the Vicente Fox administration, and he was Secretary of Foreign Relations when the terrorist attack took place in the United States. Jorge, there is this perception that the ambivalence that you expressed of the Mexican public was also expressed by the Mexican government, because it took relatively long time when you look and when you analyze what other countries did immediately in terms of expressing their condolences. And this was stated, reaffirmed by former ambassador to Mexico for the United States, Ambassador Jeffrey Davidow. Do you think, I had the opportunity to interview him this week, do you think that that there continues to be this ambivalence, and that September 11th was and has marked the relationship for the last 20 years?
No, I disagree completely with that point of view, Ana Maria. I think there was no ambivalence on the Mexican government's part. There were two issues that had to be dealt with. The first one was that we had just been in Washington, and so it seemed rather silly and exaggerated to want to go back immediately just to really express what we had expressed publicly. And secondly, at that time, by the Mexican Constitution, established that the president could only leave the country when both houses of Congress gave their explicit approval for a specific trip. And the Congress refused to give us that authorization on the window to travel to the US that I had managed to negotiate with Condoleezza Rice, who was at the NSC at the time. And so we had to wait for Congress to approve that visit. But I don't think there was any ambivalence in public statements or in other forms of solidarity, particularly regarding the question of security arrangements. And secondly, I don't think that that had any lasting consequences whatsoever on US-Mexican relations, either with the Bush administration over the following year or two, nor with subsequent administrations. I disagree completely with that point of view, and I think it's a little bit, there's a little bit of spite in there somewhere.
Jorge, let's analyze let's start thinking about lessons learned in the last 20 years, and what is the status of the bilateral relationship between both.
Well, I mean, what changed dramatically, but really was a change in relation to a change, is that for the first 7 months of the Bush administration, Mexico really was the US's #1 foreign policy priority. This is what led President Bush to make his first trip abroad to Mexico, breaking with tradition. This is what led President Fox being the first foreign leader to be hosted at a state visit in Washington, also breaking a tradition. This is what led to there being 4 or 5 meetings between President Bush and President Fox before 9/11. To give you a sense, the same 7 months by definition have gone by this year, and Presidents Biden and López Obrador have not met once. We don't know when that meeting will take place, hopefully soon. We had a very privileged situation during those 7 months, and that changed dramatically. It changed overnight. And of course, we have never become a priority again. There have been moments when Mexico has been high on the agenda, but not necessarily for good reasons. For example, with Donald Trump's wall or deportations or renegotiation of NAFTA, or with President Biden's continuing President Trump's policies on migration at the border. But other than that, we have never reestablished the priority situation we had during those months, which we really had never had before, except as a result of crises. The tequila crisis back in 1994 and 95, or perhaps during the final weeks of the NAFTA negotiations and the final weeks of the NAFTA ratification in the US Congress in 1993.
Well, it's been 20 years, and there are going to be many celebrations, or not celebrations, I said commemorations. It's a very sad event. It's a very sad day, in fact. But and there will be some commemorations here in Mexico, remembering what happened 20 years ago. Dr. Jorge Castañeda, former Secretary of Foreign Relations, I really appreciate you joining us here on Living in Mexico. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ana Maria. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Listo, Ana Maria. Bueno. Bueno.